United States.
Okay, we're going to get kicked off with this. This is a reminder that last week we were reporting from the NHS Confederation that health leaders were welcoming this new Elective Recovery Taskforce, which is all about apparently more outsourcing of NHS services to private companies. So this was the response or the comment from the Department of Health and Social Care that experts would focus on how the NHS can utilise existing capacity in the independent sector to cut the backlog. And of course, this is going to come at no extra cost to the NHS. Now, yesterday, Wes Streeting, who is the Shadow Health Secretary, was on the BBC. Well, he seemed to be agreeing with this policy, which seems unusual for the Labour Party. But anyway, here's what he said.
We already have staff who do a significant amount of work in the private sector. I'm not talking about robbing Peter to pay Paul. I'm talking about dealing with the fact that there are empty beds available in the private sector. And perhaps worse still, we have a two-tier healthcare system in this country today, where those who can pay to go private and are seen faster, and those who can't afford to pay are left lagging behind. And I think that is deeply unfair. I would rather, as a short-term measure, use the private sector to bring down NHS waiting lists faster at no cost to those people who can't afford private healthcare, at the same time as putting the investment we need to make the NHS fit the future. And that's what the last Labour government did.
So, David, I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but I mean, what we should note, of course, before you comment on this is that, as he said at the beginning of that, he acknowledged at the beginning of that little clip, many of the people that are working for these independent providers are, in fact, already also working for the National Health Service. So it is exactly robbing Peter to pay Paul, in the sense that staff are going to have to come out of the NHS to go and fulfil those tasks in the private sector. So what do you think's going on here?
Well, quite. Another politician saying, well, it's unfair. As Brian pointed out last week, childlike language doesn't really mean anything. Robbing Peter to pay Paul is the entire principle of government, because you can always be assured of the support of Paul. And there is no real analysis here of what the problem is. I spent a fascinating 3 hours on the train heading up from London on Friday with an NHS nurse discussing all of these things. It's not privatisation that's on offer, of course, because privatisation does not involve coercing the people who will use the service to use the service, or at least to pay for it. But that's what the government system does. It's all about choice. What this does is it takes the private sector and it gives it one customer, which is the state, and the people who should be the customers, the patients, they become the product. And that mindset tends to permeate everything. I find this not reassuring.
I just add that last Thursday we put out a very interesting interview with UK Column and a gentleman called Duncan White, who was looking at some of these very points. He's got a lot of experience in the NHS and outside and around the NHS in the care system. And we'll do our best to get that interview up as soon as possible. People can see some of the points that he raised, including some quite surprising revelations about who has been driving policy inside the NHS.
Also last week, Debbie Evans was talking about antibiotic availability and so on. Well, this is the Pharmaceutical Services Negotiating Committee, and they're highlighting the issue of antibiotic availability and the pricing. And this is what they're saying. Wholesale prices of many oral antibiotics have risen significantly owing to the surge in demand. This is as a result of Strep A, for example, and the ongoing supply disruptions affecting these medicines. As the majority of wholesalers are showing as out of stock on most lines, we're also hearing that some suppliers have significantly put their prices up this week for any oral antibiotics they do have in stock. Due to pricing issues affecting several medicines, including antibiotics, PSNC has applied for a record number of price concessions this month. We're very concerned that many contractors who are desperately trying to get hold of limited stock of antibiotics for their patients are paying inflated prices for these medicines without any certainty of their final reimbursement prices. And that's quite an interesting point, because some of the pharmacists are saying that they're losing £30 on every packet of antibiotics that crosses the counter. at present as a result of the fact that they're not getting reimbursement from the NHS for what they're having to buy from wholesalers. So, David,